Ladies and gentlemen, friends gathered here today, let us pause for a moment, in the quiet hush of this room, and turn our thoughts back across the centuries. Back to a time when the shadows of ignorance still clung to the edges of enlightenment, when the flicker of reason struggled against the gale of fear. Imagine, if you will, a woman named AnnaGöldi, strong, unyielding, a servant in the home of the powerful, her life a testament to endurance in a world that sought to break her. She was no sorceress, no harbinger of darkness, but a human being caught in the cruel machinery of accusation and dread. AnnaGöldi was born in 1734 in the small village of Sennwald, in the Rhine valley of what is now eastern Switzerland, a place where the mountains crowd close and the winters bite hard. She came into the world without privilege, without the cushion of wealth or the safety of a name that opened doors. Her parents were poor, ordinary folk who scratched out a living from stubborn soil and seasonal labor. From the beginning, life asked everything of her and promised little in return. She learned early that survival meant work, relentless, body-breaking work, and that a woman alone had to be twice as clever, twice as enduring, as any men who might claim authority over her. As a girl she tended animals, carried water, spun wool by candlelight until her fingers bled. When she was still young, barely into her teens, she was sent out to service, one more pair of hands hired by the season to wealthier farms and households. This was the fate of countless daughters in those valleys: leave home, earn your keep, send a few coins back if you could. Anna moved from house to house, from valley to valley, her belongings tied in a single bundle, her reputation the only capital she owned. In a society that measured a woman's worth by the men who stood behind her, father, husband, master, she had no one. No brother to defend her honor, no dowry to bargain with, no patron to whisper her name in the right ears. She was, in the eyes of the world, nobody's responsibility and therefore everybody's to command. Yet within that nobody was a somebody of fierce and quiet strength. People who knew her later would speak of a woman who met your gaze directly, who answered questions without flinching, who carried herself with a dignity that unsettled those accustomed to servile deference. She was intelligent, quick to learn, quicker to remember, and she had a tongue that could be sharp when sharpness was the only defense available to her. These were not the qualities 18th-century society wished to see in a poor female servant. A woman in her station was meant to be invisible, grateful, and above all obedient. AnnaGöldi was none of those things by nature, and she paid for it every day of her life. By her 30s she had already lived several lifetimes of hardship. She had married briefly, a union that ended in separation, itself a scandal in a Calvinist region where divorce was unthinkable and desertion marked a woman as damaged goods. She had borne children, some accounts say 2, others 3. What became of them is painfully unclear. One may have died in infancy, another perhaps taken in by relatives. The records dissolve into silence the way poor people's lives so often did. Motherhood, marriage, widowhood, or abandonment, whatever the exact truth, by the time she was 40 AnnaGöldi was alone again, still poor, still moving from post to post, still carrying the weight of every choice a woman without protection was forced to make. In 1765 fate, or misfortune, brought her to the prosperous town of Glarus, a center of the textile trade where Calvinist rectitude and new money lived side by side. There she entered the household of Johann Jacob Göldi, a respected physician, magistrate, and member of the ruling elite. For a woman like Anna this was as close to security as she would ever come: steady wages, a roof that did not leak, food that appeared regularly on the table. She worked as a maid of all work, cooking, cleaning, minding the Göldi children, rising before dawn and collapsing long after dark. For 8 years she served faithfully, competently, invisibly, or so she must have hoped. But even in that relative haven, the old rules applied. She was still a servant, still a woman, still answerable to the moods and whims of those above her. She had no contract, no rights, no court of appeal if the master's favor turned. Her resilience, the very quality that had kept her alive through decades of loss and labor, now became a liability. A woman who did not crumble under hardship could all too easily be seen as unnatural, unyielding, perhaps even dangerous. The same strength that allowed her to endure poverty, separation, the deaths of children, and the contempt of a stratified world made her stand out in a society that preferred its poor grateful and its women broken. AnnaGöldi never sought the spotlight, never courted power, never claimed more than the narrow space the world allowed her. Yet simply by continuing to exist, by refusing to disappear, by holding her head high when every circumstance told her to bow it, she became a walking challenge to the order around her. In the years to come, when fear and spite and the ancient terror of the uncontrollable feminine rose up like a tide, it would be this quiet, unbreakable core that her accusers could neither understand nor forgive. They would call it witchcraft. In truth, it was the resilience of a woman who had already survived everything the world could throw at her and still found the strength to get up each morning and face another day. In the spring and summer of 1782, the tidy Calvinist town of Glarus, proud of its textiles, its orderly council, and its distance from the crude superstitions that still haunted the Catholic valleys, discovered that the Enlightenment had not penetrated as deeply as its magistrates liked to believe. A little girl in the house of Dr. Johann Jacob Göldi fell ill. 8-year-old Anna Maria Göldi began to cough up needles, pins, and small nails that appeared mysteriously in her milk, her bread, her very mouth. The child grew pale and listless, cried out in pain, and vomited metal objects in front of horrified witnesses. The physician, who was both father and doctor, could find no natural explanation. The town's pastors were consulted. The council was summoned. And very quickly, every eye turned to the servant who had prepared the child's food, who had sat by her bed, who had been present at every outbreak of the strange affliction, AnnaGöldi. The accusations did not arrive as a thunderclap, they crept in like damp rot. At first it was whispered that the maid must have been careless, then that she bore a grudge, then that she had acted out of spite. But ordinary malice could not account for pins materializing inside a sealed body. Only one explanation still carried the power to freeze blood in an age that prided itself on reason: witchcraft. The word, which had not been spoken aloud in Glarus for decades, suddenly tasted familiar again on every tongue. The council, men who had read Voltaire and corresponded with scholars in Zurich, found themselves reaching back into the dusty statute books for laws against sorcery that had lain dormant since the 17th century. They did it quietly, almost shamefacedly, yet they did it all the same. Why Anna? Why her and not another servant, not the cook, not the nurse who had left years earlier? Because she was the perfect vessel for fear. She had no family in the canton to protest, no husband to threaten lawsuits, no wealth to hire advocates. She was 48 years old, unmarried again, childless in the eyes of the community, and possessed of that unsettling self-possession that powerful men instinctively distrust in women beneath them. Most damning of all, she had once dared to leave the Göldi household after a quarrel, taking another position elsewhere, only to be lured back with better wages when the doctor's wife grew ill. That brief assertion of independence, the simple act of walking away from a master who had mistreated her, was remembered now as proof of dangerous pride. A woman who could leave could also curse. A woman who answered back could traffic with the devil. Dr. Göldi himself, the respected magistrate whose own daughter suffered, became the quiet engine of her destruction. Modern scholars now believe he may have had more earthly reasons for wanting Anna silenced. Rumors had circulated that the maid and the master were lovers, that one of her lost children might even have been his. Whether those rumors were true or false hardly mattered, the possibility alone was enough to make her presence in his house a ticking scandal. When the child began spitting pins, the doctor saw, or engineered, a way to be rid of the woman forever while cloaking his private motives in the unimpeachable armor of public horror. Witchcraft turned a domestic embarrassment into a cosmic crime, and the accuser into the righteous guardian of his family and his town. Fear is a contagion more swift than any fever. Once the first pin was produced in court, wrapped in linen like a holy relic, the town surrendered to panic. Respectable burghers who had laughed at peasant tales of succubi now locked their doors at night. Mothers examined their children's bread for sharp glints of metal. Pastors thundered from pulpits about the devil walking abroad in the shape of a woman. And in that atmosphere, evidence was whatever the council needed it to be. Witnesses who had never noticed anything amiss suddenly remembered Anna muttering over the cooking pot, glaring at the child, or being alone in the room moments before another pin appeared. The laws of physics, of medicine, of simple probability were suspended, only the ancient logic of the witch hunt still applied. If the child suffered, someone must be to blame. If no natural cause could be found, an unnatural one must be invented. And if the accused was powerless, then justice and mercy could safely be dispensed with. So the accusation of witchcraft, that oldest and ugliest weapon against women who threatened the social order, was dusted off and sharpened anew. It mattered little that Europe's great minds had largely abandoned belief in sorcery, that the last legal execution for witchcraft on the continent had occurred decades earlier. In Glarus, in 1782, fear proved stronger than philosophy, and power stronger than both. AnnaGöldi, the nobody who had survived everything else, now faced the one thing her resilience could not outrun: a community that needed a scapegoat and a ruling class that needed her silence. The accusation was never about pins in milk. It was about a woman who had lived too independently, who knew too much, who refused to vanish quietly when her usefulness was over. And for that, the town decided, she would have to die. They arrested her on the 26th of February, 1782, dragging her from the house where she had sought refuge after fleeing the Göldi household in terror. The council had issued a warrant not for theft, not for assault, not even for attempted poisoning, crimes that might have been investigated with some pretense of evidence, but for witchcraft, a capital offense under an ordinance that had slumbered untouched for nearly 100 years. From the moment the chains closed around her wrists, AnnaGöldi entered a machinery designed not to discover truth but to manufacture confession, and every gear in that machine was oiled with pain. They took her first to the town prison, a damp stone box beneath the council house where light came only through a grill high in the wall. There she sat for weeks while the magistrates argued behind closed doors about whether they dared revive the old sorcery laws at all. Enlightenment voices in Zurich and Bern were already whispering that Glarus had lost its mind, yet local pride and local fear proved stronger than distant ridicule. On the 13th of March they transferred her to the castle at Glarus, to a cell so narrow she could neither lie down fully nor stand upright without touching iron on every side. There the real work began. The interrogations were presided over by the council's appointed torturers, men who still knew the old craft because their fathers had practiced it. They began gently, by the standards of the time, questions repeated hour after hour, sleep denied, bread and water withheld until the tongue swelled. When simple exhaustion produced no confession, they moved to the thumbscrews. Iron clamps were fastened around each thumb and slowly tightened while the scribes asked again and again whether she had made a pact with the devil, whether she had caused the pins to appear in the child's body, whether she had flown through the night to a Sabbath on the Klausen Pass. Anna denied everything. She wept, she begged, she invoked God, but she would not confess to impossibilities. So they escalated. They stripped her naked, always the first humiliation, the reduction of a woman to flesh that could be inspected for the devil's marks, and shaved her head and body in search of the witch's teat where an imp might suck. Finding nothing that satisfied them, they bound her in the strappado, hands tied behind her back, rope thrown over a ceiling beam, and then she was hoisted until her shoulders dislocated with a wet pop that echoed through the chamber. They left her dangling for the length of a paternoster, then dropped her so that the jolt tore screams from her throat. Again and again they raised and dropped her while the questions rang out like hammer blows. Still she would not give them the story they needed. Next came the ladder, a wooden frame to which she was tied spread-eagled while the torturer applied red-hot pincers to the softest parts of her body. The smell of burning skin filled the room. The scribes noted clinically that the accused continued obstinate. They poured cold water over the burns to keep her conscious, then resumed. Between sessions they left her alone in the dark with her pain, whispering through the door that confession would bring release, that only liars suffered so long. Days blurred into nights, time lost meaning. Food, when it came, was drugged with something that made her head swim and her tongue thick. She began to hallucinate voices telling her to confess and be done. Finally, after weeks of this calculated destruction, they brought in the ultimate instrument, the Spanish boot, 2 iron plates lined with inward-facing spikes that were screwed together around each calf until the bones cracked. The pain was beyond screaming. Witnesses later said the sound she made was no longer human. At that point something inside Anna broke, not her spirit, that would never break, but the last tether holding her to the world of coherent resistance. In a voice barely audible she agreed to confess if they would only stop. They stopped long enough for the scribes to sharpen their quills. The confession they dictated was a tapestry of the usual absurdities, that the devil had appeared to her in the shape of a black dog, that she had signed a pact in blood, that he had given her a sack of magical pins with which to torment that Göldi child out of revenge for imagined slights. She repeated the words they fed her, syllable by syllable, while the notary wrote and the council members nodded in grim satisfaction. When it was finished they read it back to her and demanded she swear to its truth before God. Half conscious, legs shattered, shoulders torn from their sockets, she swore. The confession, extracted under torture so savage that even some council members later admitted unease, became the cornerstone of the prosecution. In the eyes of the law it transformed suspicion into fact, accusation into guilt, a living woman into a condemned witch. They allowed her no advocate, no opportunity to retract, no public hearing where the circumstances of her confession might be examined. The trial, if the closed meetings of the council could be called a trial, lasted only days once the written confession existed. On the 13th of June, 1782, the verdict was read, guilty of witchcraft by her own admission, sentence of death by the sword. The machinery had done its work with merciless efficiency. From the moment the first chain touched her skin to the moment the death sentence was sealed, less than 4 months had passed, yet in that brief span a human being had been systematically dismantled until she would say anything, true or false, to make the pain stop. That is what passed for justice in Glarus when fear and power joined hands. June 13, 1782, dawned hot and still over the town of Glarus. By 7 in the morning the streets leading to the execution ground outside the eastern gate were already thick with people. Whole families had come, some walking miles from the mountain villages, bringing bread and cheese as though for a fair. Children were hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. Vendors sold beer and gingerbread. The council had forbidden music and dancing, yet the mood was unmistakably festive, the way crowds always gather when a spectacle is promised and the victim is someone who never truly belonged. Inside the castle prison, AnnaGöldi had spent her last night on earth. The broken legs that had forced her confession would not carry her now, so the executioner's assistants lifted her onto a rough wooden sledge and dragged her through the streets like a sack of grain. She wore the simple gray shift they had given her after the torture stopped, its hem stiff with old blood. Her head had never been covered again after the shaving, the stubble was now a dull silver fuzz that caught the sun. Iron cuffs still encircled her wrists, but her ankles were splinted and bound together with rope because the bones inside the Spanish boots had been reduced to splinters. Every jolt of the sledge over the cobbles must have been fire, yet those close enough to see her face later swore she did not cry out. She stared straight ahead, lips moving faintly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in simple refusal to give them one more sound. At the place of execution, a low rise called the Galgenbuhl, the scaffold had been raised the day before, a plain platform of fresh pine planks, a single upright post, and beside it the block. No gallows this time, the council had decreed death by the sword, a privilege normally reserved for nobility, granted now with bitter irony to the last witch of Europe. A company of halberdiers in blue and white kept a ring around the platform, but the crowd pressed so close that the soldiers' boots sank into the soft earth. The town's pastors stood in a solemn knot to one side, black gowns fluttering like crows. Dr. Göldi was nowhere to be seen, the righteous father had chosen not to watch the final act of the drama he had authored. They hauled her up the 3 steps with no pretense of gentleness. When her ruined legs buckled, the executioner himself caught her under the arms and half-carried her the last distance. He was a big man from Schwyz, hooded in red, his broadsword already unsheathed and resting against the block. 2 assistants forced Anna to her knees. Because she could not kneel unaided, they looped a rope around her torso and tied it to the post so that she remained upright, facing the crowd. Someone had placed a strip of linen over her eyes, but it slipped almost immediately. She shook her head once, sharply, and the cloth fell to the planks. She would meet the blade uncovered. A clerk stepped forward and read the sentence in a loud, hurried voice, that AnnaGöldi, also called Göldi, having confessed to witchcraft and commerce with the devil, was to be beheaded with the sword, her body thereafter to be burned to ashes so that no remnant of evil might remain. The crowd murmured approval. A few women crossed themselves out of old habit and then remembered they were reformed and stopped. The executioner lifted the sword to test its balance, sunlight ran along the edge like liquid fire. In that last moment, something extraordinary happened. Anna turned her head, slowly, painfully, and looked out over the thousands who had come to see her die. No one later agreed on exactly what her expression held. Some said defiance, some said pity, some said nothing at all, only a vast exhaustion. A girl near the front remembered years afterward that the condemned woman's lips moved again, forming words no one could hear above the crowd's restless noise. Perhaps a prayer for her children, wherever they were. Perhaps a curse on the town that had devoured her. Perhaps only the names of the dead she was about to join. The executioner took his stance. 2 strides back, feet planted wide. He raised the sword high, the blade catching the sun one final time. For an instant the entire hillside seemed suspended, breath held, heart stilled. Then the arms came down in a single clean arc. There was a sound like a butcher cleaving a side of beef, dull and wet. The body sagged against the ropes, the head rolled forward and struck the platform with a soft thud before coming to rest staring sideways at the sky it would never see again. A thin red line appeared across the neck and widened quickly into a dark flood that soaked the fresh pine. Some in the crowd cheered, others turned away, a few stood frozen, as though only then realizing what they had watched. The assistants untied the corpse and carried it down the steps to the waiting fire, a great heap of pine logs and straw already prepared in a hollow below the hill. They laid the body and the head together on the pyre, poured oil, and set the torch. Flames leapt up with a roar, and soon the smell of burning flesh drifted across the field. People began to leave almost at once, as if the spell had broken. By the time the fire burned down to embers, only the soldiers and the execution party remained, raking the ashes to be sure nothing whole was left. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe was over, and the Enlightenment, for all its proud proclamations, had looked away. The ashes cooled on the Galgenbuhl, the crowd melted back into their orderly houses, and for more than 2 centuries the town of Glarus did its best to forget that anything extraordinary had ever happened on that June afternoon. The council sealed the trial records, pastors stopped mentioning the name from their pulpits, and the Göldi family closed ranks behind a wall of respectable silence. AnnaGöldi was meant to disappear the way poor women had always disappeared, without trace, without protest, without consequence. Yet something in the violence of her death refused to lie quiet. For decades the story lived only in whispers: the servant who spat pins, the doctor who feared scandal more than Satan, the council that tortured a confession and then beheaded a woman for a crime it half knew was impossible. Travelers passing through the canton heard fragments and carried them farther afield, until by the middle of the 19th century educated Europe began to feel a slow, creeping shame. Newspapers in Zurich and Geneva wrote cautious articles asking how such a thing could have happened in 1782, long after Voltaire and Beccaria had supposedly banished torture and superstition to the dustbin of history. Glarus answered with embarrassed silence or outright denial. Some local historians insisted the execution had been for poisoning, not witchcraft, as if changing the label could wash the blood from the planks. The real awakening came only after the Second World War, when a new generation, sickened by what legalized inhumanity could achieve, began to look harder at its own past. In the 1950s a young teacher named Walter Hauser started digging through forgotten archives and discovered the original trial protocol, still sealed in dusty folders. What he read horrified him: the thumbscrews, the strappado, the Spanish boots, the dictated confession, the swift sentence. He published his findings modestly, almost apologetically, yet the book struck like a bell. Suddenly AnnaGöldi was no longer a shameful footnote but a mirror held up to an entire society. People began to speak her name aloud again, not with fear but with sorrow. By the 1980s the pressure had become irresistible. Feminist scholars, human rights advocates, church groups, and ordinary citizens demanded that the canton confront what it had done. Petitions circulated, documentaries were filmed, plays were written. In 1981, on the 200th anniversary of her arrest, hundreds gathered at the Galgenbuhl to lay flowers where the scaffold had stood. They came in rain and mountain wind, carrying candles and simple wooden crosses, and for the first time the town did not look away. The official reckoning came piecemeal, the way such reckonings always do when pride and guilt wrestle in the same breast. In 2001 the Glarus Cantonal Parliament voted to rehabilitate AnnaGöldi morally, though it stopped short of declaring her legally innocent. The past, apparently, still had some rights that the living were reluctant to violate. Then, in 2008, after years of campaigning, the Parliament went further. It acknowledged that AnnaGöldi had been the victim of a judicial murder, that the trial had been a travesty, that torture had been used to extract a false confession, and that she had been executed for a crime that did not exist. On the 27th of August of that year, exactly 226 years after she lost her head, the canton of Glarus formally exonerated her. The president of the Parliament stood before the assembly and spoke the words the town had waited 2 centuries to hear: "We are deeply sorry." That same summer the AnnaGöldi Museum opened in the old Göldi house in Enenda, the very rooms where the nightmare had begun. Visitors walk past the kitchen where pins supposedly appeared in milk, past the narrow staircase she climbed 1,000 times with firewood and water, past the parlor where Dr. Göldi once received patients who trusted his judgment absolutely. On the top floor, behind glass, lie copies of the torture protocols, the death sentence, the executioner's bill for 20 gulden and expenses. And everywhere, quietly watching, are portraits of Anna reconstructed from the few surviving descriptions: a woman neither beautiful nor ugly, neither young nor old, with steady eyes that seemed to ask a single, unanswerable question: how could you? Her legacy now belongs not only to Glarus but to the world. School children learn her story alongside those of Galileo and the Salem victims, as proof that the border between civilization and barbarity is thinner than we like to believe. Lawyers invoke her name when arguing against evidence obtained by pain. Feminists carry her memory into battles against every system that still punishes women for being inconvenient, outspoken, or simply in the way. Every year on the 13th of June, people gather again at the place where the scaffold stood, not to celebrate a spectacle but to stand in silence for the length of time it takes a head to fall. They come because forgetting would be the final injustice, because remembering is the only reparation the dead can still receive. AnnaGöldi never asked to be a martyr or a symbol. She only wanted to live, to work, to be left in peace. Yet in dying the way she did, under the bright June sun while a whole town watched and did nothing, she became something larger, a warning carved in bone and fire that no society is ever finally safe from its own darkness, that reason and cruelty can inhabit the same breast, that the Enlightenment was never a guarantee but only a fragile promise we must keep renewing, generation after generation, or lose. Her severed head, staring sideways at a sky she was not allowed to rejoin, still looks out across the centuries, asking every one of us what we will do when fear and power once again demand a sacrifice. The only answer we can honorably give is to refuse, to stand in the way, to insist that no woman, no man, no human being will ever again be broken on the wheel of someone else's terror. That is the legacy she left us, not in words but in blood and silence, and it is the one we are now charged to carry forward until justice is no longer a rare exception but the air we all breathe.